blood, try to hit me in the gut, thinking that I won't react. You whispering my name, thinking I won't be the same. Turn fiction into fact. See what you didn't know, bruises that'll never show, slipping on your every jab. So tighten up your fist, step into the ring with this. I hope your mama's got your back. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, holding the sound of my name in the crowd. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. Just 'cause I took a break, you're making a huge mistake, thinking you can take the throne. Look at you trembling, step into the lion's den. Bet you wish you stayed at home. Begging for mercy underneath your breath when I ain't even sweating yet. My legend's written in the stone, yeah. You're crying danger in defeat is now your only friend. Even your mama's gotta know. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, holding the sound of my name in the crowd. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. You didn't bust. Oh, oh,
Hello, hello, and welcome everyone to In Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Suter. Thank you for joining us. We've been wanting to do debates here on In Time for quite some time, and we've had a number of ones that almost happened and then we fell through. But we have a reasonably particular format, and it's going to be a little different than a number of debates that you are used to. In Time is an educational program, which means that while I do believe in debates, and I believe in strong disagreements and people putting forth positions with passion, our goal is to have everyone understand the perspective of each of the debaters and to understand their positions and to have the best possible communication and debate between the two. Ergo, my role here as moderator will be twofold. First, to enforce the rules of the debate, to which both gentlemen have agreed to, and second, to, if it gets to a point where we appear that there is an impasse, where they are either speaking past each other or one of them has perhaps misunderstood the argument, if I feel like I can insert myself and perhaps clarify a position, I will do so. I will do this for any side that I think is not being represented as strongly as it should be. This is not going to be an endorsement of either position, and in some cases, maybe one side or another that I will come in on more, and it's just to add clarity, and this will be based entirely at the discretion of the moderator. We would like very much to hear your questions. I will be monitoring the live chat, and any questions I will be writing down and keeping track of. The format is as follows. The topic is God the author of sin? God, in this case, will be essentially the Judeo-Christian God, and in this case, it is going to be from a Calvinist perspective. Floyd FP will have the affirmative, and Will Stewart will have the negative in the discussion. So without further ado, what I'm going to do here is we're going to move to our debate layout. And I would like to introduce both Will and Stewart. Gentlemen, how are you? Sorry, both Will and Stewart. Will and Floyd. Gentlemen, how are you?
Good. Oh, fine, thanks. Thanks for having me.
All right.
Yeah, thanks for having us on. It'll be great.
Absolutely our pleasure. We've all been looking forward to this for some time now. So, as I said before, this topic is God the author of sin? And we're going to be discussing this from a Calvinistic position. Floyd will have the affirmative. Floyd, since you have the affirmative, you will have roughly 5 minutes. We also aren't going to keep necessarily strict track, or obviously we don't want people to meander on, but if you need a little more time to make your point, make your point. You have roughly 5 minutes to give your introduction as to your argument. Will have roughly 5 minutes to give his introduction. You will each get a 5-minute rebuttal, and then we'll go into an open discussion. So if that sounds good, Floyd, whenever you are ready.
Okay, hopefully I can fit everything in 5 minutes, but we'll see. So let me share my PowerPoint. All right, so the discussion of the debate is God the author of sin? So we have three terms here we need to break down: God, author, and sin. So what do we mean by those three? So let's talk about God first. We're talking about a particular God, and this is the God of Calvinism. So this is a debate about Calvinistic theology of how it views God. All right, the next term is author. What does author mean? Well, in a narrow sense, it means a writer or originator of any written work. But I think where we're using it here is in a more broader sense. So it's originator or gave existence to anything. So I think the author here is being used in a broader sense. And then lastly, sin. Well, how do we define sin? Well, we should define sin in terms of Calvinistic theology. So I hope I'm representing the term correct, that Will would agree with. I'm sure he'll correct me if he doesn't agree with it. But I'm defining sin here as transgression against God's law, missing the mark to the standards God sets on humans. So those are the three terms that as I see them. And I guess we can have a discussion if any of them are off. All right, so let's move forward. Okay, so again, we're talking about the Calvinistic God, and in Calvinism, God is divinely sovereign. He's in control over all creation, and God decrees all things according to His will. So John Calvin writes, "We hold that God is the disposer and ruler of all things, that from the remotest eternity, according to his own wisdom, he decreed what he was to do, and now by his power executes what he decreed. Hence, we maintain that by his providence, not heaven and earth and inanimate creatures only, but also the counsels and wills of men are so governed as to move exactly in the course which he has destined." So John Calvin continues, "Let him, therefore, who would beware of such unbelief also bear in mind that there is no random power or agency or motion in the creatures who are so governed by the secret counsel of God that nothing happens but he has knowingly and willingly decreed." What are these things that he controls? Well, he controls the will of men, and what sort of men? Well, all men. That includes the wills of men, of thieves and murderers and other evildoers, are instruments of divine providence, being employed by the Lord Himself to execute the judgments which He has resolved to inflict. And he goes on, the first man fell because the Lord deemed it met that he should. While he deemed it met, we know not. It is certain, however, that it was just because he saw that his own glory would therefore be displayed. So God decreed that Adam and Eve would fall, and all the consequences and sinful nature that men would inherit accordingly. And Calvinists usually draw on Scripture to support their cases, and a common one they use is Ephesians 1:11, which is, "In Him, according to the purpose of Him who accomplishes all things according to the counsel of His will," and that includes down to a roll of a dice. So we read in Proverbs 16:33, "The lot is cast in the laps, but the decision was wholly from the Lord." So when you roll a dice, when you draw lots, it's not really random. God was actually controlled the whole thing. So Calvinist theologian Gordon Clark writes that it be unequivocally said that this view certainly makes God the cause of sin. God is the sole ultimate cause of everything. There is absolutely nothing independent of him. He alone is the eternal being. He alone is omnipotent. He alone is sovereign. Not only is Satan his creature, but every detail of history was eternally in his plan before the world became. He willed that it should all come to pass. The men and angels predestined to eternal life and those foreordained to everlasting death are particularly and unchangeably designed, and their number is so certain and definite that it cannot be either increased or decreased. Election and reprobation is equally ultimate. God determined that Christ should die. He determined as well that Judas should betray him. There is never the remotest possibility that something different could have happened. And for those who are familiar with Calvinist creeds, you can see he's pulling right from the Westminster Confession of Faith for some of these sentences here. So here we have a problem between divine sovereignty versus human free will. If God is sovereign over all things, is God the author of sin and evil? Does God deny humans their free will? Well, I want to steelman the Calvinist view here, and many moderate and lower Calvinists answer no to both of these questions, that God is not the author of sin and God does not deny humans free will. Calvinists generally reject libertarian free will, but affirm a compatibilist view of free will. But how do we square that with divine sovereignty? But to support my case here, we read in John Calvin's Institutes, man falls according to God's providence ordains, but he falls by his own fault. In the Westminster Confession of Faith 3:1, we read, God from all eternity did the most wise and holy counsel of his own will freely and unchangeably ordained whatever comes to pass. Yet so, I highlight yet because we'll see that a lot. They'll say, Calvinists will say one thing, but then they'll affirm the other. Yet so, thereby neither God is the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures, nor is the liberty or contingency of second causes taken away, but rather established. So here we have the Westminster Confession of Faith declaring that God is not the author of sin, but my position that he is the author of sin. So I'll need to defend that a little later. Again, the Westminster Confession of Faith 5:4 says the almighty power, unsearchably wisdom, and infinite goodness of God so far manifest themselves in his providence that extendeth its even to the first fall and to other sins of angels and men, and that not by a bare permission, but such hath joined with the most wise and powerful bounding and otherwise ordering and governing of them in a manifold dispensation to his own holy ends. Yet so, here's yet again, as the sinfulness therefore proceedeth only from the creature and not from God, who, being the most holy and righteous, neither nor can be the author or approver of sin. So how can this be? Well, hopefully Will shed some light, and hopefully I'll offer some clues as well. Again, Westminster Confession of Faith 6:1, our first parents, being seduced by the subtlety and temptation of Satan, sinned in eating the forbidden fruit. Their sin, their sin, God was pleased, according to his wise and holy counsel, to permit, and having purposed to order it to his own glory. What Calvinists will claim, though, is God never tempts people. When tempted, no one says, God is tempting me, for God cannot tempt by evil, nor can he tempt anyone, for each one is tempted when his own evil desire is dragged away and enticed. So they use this verse to say, well, God doesn't tempt people to sin. But yet they acknowledge that God decreed that humans would sin. All right. So the late R.C. Sproul writes, if there is one single molecule in this universe running around loose, totally free of God's sovereignty, then we have no guarantee that a single promise of God will ever be fulfilled. Perhaps the one maverick molecule will lay waste all the grand and glorious plans that God has made and promised to us. If it is true in some sense, God foreordains everything that comes to pass, then it follows with no doubt that God must foreordain the entrance of sin into the world. This is not to say that God forced it to happen or that he imposed evil upon his creation. All that means is that God must have decided to allow it to happen. In spite of this excruciating problem, we must still affirm that God is not the author of sin. I don't know how they affirm that, but it just becomes part of their doctrine. One way they try to explain it is through secondary and proximate causes versus primary and ultimate causes. Cornelius Van Til, in his reply to J. Oliver Bussell, writes, Calvin denies vigorously that he makes God the author of sin. I, with equal consonance, asserted that the eternal death to which man rendered himself subject to proceedeth from his own fault, that God cannot in any way be considered the author of it. Here Calvin makes a distinction between remote and proximate causes. As the proximate cause of sin, man is guilty before God. When therefore you object to my saying that God is the ultimate cause, back whatsoever comes to pass, you will also need to reject Calvin's distinction between proximate and remote causes. I was simply reproducing Calvin's argument against Pigley. With Pigley, you will have to say that man's deeds of wickedness are the cause and the only and final cause of his eternal state. And there you will have, as Calvin points out, virtually denies the doctrine of sovereign grace of God in the case of the elect. I do not think that you can show how Ephesians 1:11, which says that God worketh all things after the counsel of his own will, is very different. Is a very different statement from saying God is the ultimate or remote cause back of all things, without falling into Arminianism. All right, so the Calvinist definition of author of sin is understood as reference to a secondary causation.
Let me interrupt for just 1 second.
Yeah.
So because you have the PowerPoint, I know you wanted to take some extra time. So we've gone into about 10 minutes, and I do want to make sure that Will, because this is maybe a lot of information for Will to absorb. So do you think a few more minutes on this, and then we can pass off to Will?
I think I just have 3 more slides. So.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, so I'll finish up here. An objector may call the Calvinist God the author of sin, where he is referring to God being the ultimate primary cause of sin, where the Calvinist will say he is not the author of sin since he is referring to the secondary cause. So God is not performing the sinful act, but rather decreeing it to happen. This is confusing since defining authorship as only secondary causation when there is a prior metaphysical primary cause which determined it. So God is the metaphysical author of sin, i.e. the primary ultimate cause, but is not committing the sinful act himself. The issue is one of metaphysical causation. Hence, under this subject of metaphysical causation, God is the ultimate cause, while man, the one who sins, is the secondary cause. So shouldn't that authorship refer to the ultimate cause and not the secondary cause? I think it does. The author of a book is the immediate cause. God is its ultimate cause, according to Gordon Clark. And I agree with that statement. Gordon Clark goes on and says, God is neither responsible nor sinful, even though he is the ultimate cause of everything. He is not sinful because, in the first place, whatever God does is just and right. It is just and right simply in virtue of the fact that he does it. Justice or righteousness is not a standard external to God to which God is obligated to submit. Righteousness is what God does. Since God caused Judas to betray Christ, this causal act is righteous and not sinful. By definition, God cannot sin. At that first point, it must be particularly pointed out that God's causing a man to sin is not sin. There is no law superior to God which forbids him to decree sinful acts, since sin presupposes law, and for sin is lawlessness. Sin is any want of conformity unto transgression of the law of God, but God is ex lax. And Calvin himself says everything which God wills must be held to be righteous by the mere fact of his willing it. Therefore, when it is asked why the Lord so did, we must answer because he pleased. So with this in mind, it sounds like morality in the Calvinist view is based on not what you do, but who you are. So if God does it, it's righteous. If his creation does it, it's not. So again, it's based on who you are, not what you do. I'll skip over this for now. I'm going to go right to my argument. And here is my argument that shows the incoherence of the Calvinist doctrine. So this is a deductive syllogism I put together. One, God is not the author of sin, claims the moderate or lower Calvinist and John Calvin himself. Two, if God was pleased by his own will to predestine, foreordain, unchangeably design the fall of all humanity, created our sinful nature, foreordained sinful actions, and led man to do them by the Spirit of God, then God is the author of sin. Three, God was pleased by his own will to predestine, foreordain, unchangeably design the fall of all humanity, created our sinful nature, foreordained our sinful actions, and led man to do them by the Spirit of God. Therefore, God is the author of sin. That's modus ponens from 2 and 3. And then at 5, we have God is the author of sin, and God is not the author of sin, which is a reductio ad absurdum between 1 and 4. So I will leave it at that, at this contradiction within Calvinist theology. And again, I assert that God is in fact the author of sin.
All right, Floyd, thank you very much for that. So Will, he went on for a little over about 15, 16 minutes. So, but again, it's so, take whatever time you need. Make sure, you hit the points. You don't need to take any more time than you, just whatever works and however you're comfortable. So whenever you're ready.
Yeah, no, I mean, where do we begin? I'm glad that you started the presentation with defining the terms from the Calvinistic world view, but then it seems like in the middle of your presentation, it kind of shifted back to a different definition of sin. So if sin, if evil, is disobeying God, how can God disobey himself? So is God the author of sin and that he created everything that exists? And so therefore the things that transgress his law are sinning against him, right? Sin is against God. It's not against each other. And for me, that's where I get on the point of I don't understand how God can necessarily be the author of sin. Has he predestined and predetermined everything to happen? Yes. Right? Has he prescribed those things to happen in the first place? Yes. But could he partake in that, and by allowing that, is he guilty of sin himself? No. That's the contradiction that's inside Calvinism, right? Because God can't disobey himself. It's a power. It's a homogeneous statement that we're making, right? What is the power of God? What is the sovereignty of God? How divine is God, right? What kind of being is he if he is a triomni being, which I believe is fairly clear that the Christian Bible teaches a theology of a triomni being. But so that being said, it just depends on how you want to define words. Is God responsible for, it's God said it himself to Joseph and his brothers, right? What your brothers meant for evil, right? I meant for good. So the purpose that evil that God caused, because he's not saying that I did it. He's saying I meant it. I did it. Right? I wanted it to happen, but I wanted it to happen for good. They wanted for it to happen for evil, and they're punished for their evil. So it just depends on how you want to define authorship and the word sin itself and what sin is it whether God's the author of it or not. And that's pretty much it for my opening.
All right. Let's actually then, instead of having a rebuttal, just go straight into the discussion if that works for each of you. So I think
Sure.
Floyd, he has asked. He's made a couple of points both about the definition of sin and authorship. So open discussion for you gentlemen.
Yeah, well, I think we both agreed on the definition of sin, where it's a transgression against God's law. And God can't break his own law because he's the creator of it. But I guess we're back to what we mean by author. Imagine I'm a author of a murder mystery novel, and I have the murderer commit horrendous acts. Now,
Okay.
the murderer committed those acts, but it was my will as the author that made him do it. I created a situation. I created his will to commit those murders. So even though he was the secondary cause, as Calvinists do it, I was the ultimate and primary cause of it. And I'm the one creating these characters, right, as the author of this book. So that's where I think the confusion is taking place, where the author is one creating everything, right, and the actors are committing the acts, so to speak. But again, by the direction of whom? Of the author. So again, I don't understand how I don't understand how you can say, well, humans are the author of sin when God is ultimately decreeing that these sins take place. So I think it makes more sense to say, no, God is the author of everything, as Gordon Clark acknowledges. God is the cause of everything, including sin, including the fall of man, including the sinful nature of man, and to a point where the unregenerated man can do no good at all. man has no power within himself to do any good. His any acts that he does is filthy rags to this God. So again, I think it just simply makes more sense as God as the author of the reality of human history, that we would call him the author of sin, and as well as
Yeah,
the
but I
author
mean,
of everything.
what's the intent? What's the intent in calling him the author, though? Is the intent in saying that he's responsible for it?
Well, yeah, I mean, ultimately he has to be responsible for it. He didn't have to create anything at all, right? But he decreed that it would all happen.
But
He didn't have to decree it
responsible
that way,
in a
but he was
moral
pleased.
way is what I mean. Yeah. Responsible in a moral way is my question, right? He's evil because he ordained it. Is that the statement that's being made, or no?
I don't think we need to say that God is evil. Because the debate topic is he the author of sin? Now, I guess the question is, if you have an author of sin, is that person evil? If your answer is yes, then we could call God evil. I mean, in my worldview, the Calvinist God is evil, but I'm just trying to do an internal critique and point out
Yeah, right.
that,
So
since God is the initiator, is the instigator of sin, that he must be the author of sin as well. Since
and it's difficult for
he
me.
set up everything.
You know what we can say, Will?
It's difficult for me to be affirmative or pull the no here. If you're talking about, is God sovereign over all things? Did God create all that exists? Well, the answer is yes. Right? Obviously, it's yes. I don't care what necessarily theological school you come from. If you're taking it to that ultimate authority, does everything that exists, was it created by God? And God's the author of sin, regardless of whether you're Arminian, Molinist, Calvinist, or whatever, because it couldn't exist if God hadn't created it. And since it exists, he's therefore the author of it. So it's a very tricky situation. Now, are you saying that God is directly enjoying committing evil acts to people? My answer would be no, because that's not what he's doing. He's prescribed that these events happen, but he's not taking pleasure or enjoyment in them. They're happening to accomplish his will, his purpose.
You're saying
It's a necessary.
Well, it sounds
You're
like
saying he wasn't pleased.
He's not pleased in the evil.
Fall? I mean, Calvin directly says that he was pleased to make man fall. In fact, everything
he was pleased to do so in order to
he's
accomplish his will, his purpose. Right. He's pleased to do so to accomplish his purpose.
Own glory. Right. He does everything for his own glory. Yeah. Right. So he's pleased.
But what I'm saying is he's not taking enjoyment. He's not taking enjoyment in that person's suffering. What he's doing is he is pleased with how things are running. You have to think it too. God does not see things sequentially. He sees all things all at one time, right? Past, present, future, all at once.
Right.
So events are just
he saw them suffering, and he knew what he decreed would make them suffer. Right?
He saw the suffering, but he also saw the end result of what his plan had accomplished here on earth, and he was pleased in that. Right? He's pleased in the whole.
He's not pleased.
Well, as the Bible says, there are times when God's not pleased. He's pleased with the result. He may not be pleased with the individual pieces of that end result.
So he may not be pleased with individual actions, but he's pleased with whatever this final tapestry is, because he sees the entire picture where we see a piece of it.
So he had to go through,
it's like the tapestry that's
all these circumstances, all these years of sin and suffering and so forth, just for the final results. Is that what you're saying? That he was unpleased with what he decreed, what happened before the end result happened?
No, he sees all of those
So
at
you can
one
say
time.
that since God decreed it all, I would think he
Right.
would be pleased with everything that happens because he decreed it. Why would he not decree it?
The Bible is very clear that there are certain things that displease God. You can start right in Genesis.
According to his prescriptive will or secret will.
Prescriptive is what he tells us to do. Secret will is the overarching plan, right?
Right.
The final purpose that we don't know. Yeah.
So man clearly goes, when he sins, he clearly goes against God's prescriptive will. But in his secret will, he
That's what
decreed
sin
everything
is.
that would come to pass. Right.
I'm confused. I'm confused as I'm agreeing with you. So what I think we need to know to go move in this discussion is, what is your position rather than the internal critique? Where do you see that there are faults with this? Because if you're just going to state what we believe, then I would have to just agree with everything you said.
Well, I agree with higher Calvinist Vincent Chung says, where he writes, contrary to the traditional explanation, God does not say, "Oh no, I am not the author of sin. Although I am the ultimate cause of all things, I distance myself from directly causing sin by establishing secondary causes and free agents. So although I created and sustain all things, man freely sinned by thinking and acting according to his own disposition. The evil dispositions come from Adam. As far as as for how Adam got his evil disposition, well, it just remains a mystery. It just remains a mystery for you. If this is the answer, why not jump right to the mystery and save us all time? Instead of giving the popular answer, which is weak, evasive, incoherent, and confusing, God unashamedly declares, "Yes, I do all these things. What are you going to do about it? Who are you to even ask me about it? When it comes to metaphysics, including God's relationship to human decisions, whether for good or for evil, this is how the Bible responds." So Vincent Chung, who's a higher Calvinist, agrees that God is the authors, and I agree with him.
Well, like I said earlier, I would agree with him as well. If you're picking on the stipulation, is he the one who has done everything? Now, if you're going to say that because God is therefore the ultimate author of that sin, right? Like, for instance, if he's writing a book and the character in the book murders someone else, did he write the book? Absolutely. But did he kill the person in the book? Not directly, right? So it just depends on what position that you're going to put in behind it as to whether I can affirm it, right? Are you saying it just depends?
Well, and we talked earlier.
I'm saying God is the author of it. God created the will of that murderer. He set up the whole thing.
Well,
God is the author. God is the author of the story, where the murderer is just the actor following the directions of God, which he has no ability to do otherwise.
I agree.
He's totally depraved and lacks all ability to follow God's prescriptive will.
Well, so let's, because there was an interesting concept earlier that we sort of glossed over. So it sounds like actually that we would have general agreement in terms of how these words have been defined here. But we've talked about sort of first order and second order concepts, including like free will. And we haven't talked about first order and second order sin. And the reason I think that may be important is because Will seemed to be concerned with what some of the consequences of this could be. Floyd had pointed out that that's obviously not necessarily the subject of this debate, but since we do have large agreement, it might be worth exploring this. But if you're going to define sin, of course, as going against God's will, then the question is, okay, if God is the author, which there appears to be a general agreement on it in terms of how we've defined those terms so far. If God is the author, well, we know, when somebody does a sin, they are sinning. They're doing something bad. Can God sin in that sense? It seems like I would say probably not, because if he's the author, then he can't go against his own will, very much like Will said. But what does that say then for Floyd's point on the fact that he still is, in fact, the author of these people who are sinning? So is that a topic that we can maybe take a step forward and think about?
Yeah,
Sure.
I think another analogy is the insurrection on January 6th. We heard a lot of the insurrections saying, Trump told us to be here. Trump told us to come. We're following his orders. Well, in this case, the will of men is being foreordained and decreed by God. So I think it's kind of it's even more drastic than Trump simply telling people to defend your freedom and stop voter corruption. Here, God is actually controlling and foreordaining the wills of men to act a certain way. So again, man is totally depraved to do otherwise. So he has to do what God wills.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you.
There's a bit of a lag. There's a bit of a lag, Floyd, and I think what happens is you catch the lag, and so you keep going to fill the time. But it takes Will a couple of seconds, I think, to catch up. So, Will, what was your response going to be?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, me personally, do I think did Trump run into the Capitol and try to do anything on his own? No, he didn't. Those people are responsible for their actions. Trump is responsible for his actions. He's not responsible for their actions, even though he may have incited them to do so, unless he specifically said, go and kill that person, and then held his arm up and put the gun to the guy, helped him pull the trigger, right? On our view, right? But Trump isn't the creator of all things, and it depends on. We really have to get into the weight of this, right? If everyone here and watching the show is in agreement that God is the supreme, ultimate, triomni being, sovereign being in the universe, then there's no issue, right? Because there's no fingers pointing at that being and saying, "Why have you done this to me?" Because who would dare do that, right? Paul's very clear in Romans, for example. So, if there is a charge being made, it's the charge that I think that we should necessarily be discussing rather than the critique. Because if that triumni God exists and he is who he says he is in Scripture, then he is more than has the authority to do as he pleases, with whom he pleases, how he pleases, and there is nothing that we could and or should say to it about it.
Well, Floyd, you had said that you think the Calvinist God is evil, so it sounds like this may be a decent way to segment into that view. Is that something you'd be up for expanding on?
Well, based on my standards, on my worldview, I think the Calvinist God is evil because he creates suffering unnecessarily, and he does it for his own glory. So he's basically a egotistical tyrant where his might makes right, basically. But that's my standard of morality. So I prefer to do more of an internal critique and expose a contradiction.
But even from an internal,
yeah.
I haven't heard of the contradiction. Right. The Westminster Confession was, and the reason why those particular texts are included in that particular fashion is because there were assertions from Arminians and Molinists stating that Calvinists are saying that God sins, and that it's an evil doctrine. The reason why those confessions are pulling away from that isn't that God commits evil himself. The confessions are written in that way to state that their theological belief, is that God doesn't sin; He's incapable of it. Right. So their definition of sin were two different things than what the definition that we're using here. So it just depends on what that particular individual's definition of sin was and how they were using it as a reference. Those two things have to be congruent for your internal critique to show a contradiction.
Well, and Floyd, you differentiate here also, Floyd, between sin and evil, right? So let's make sure that we're not using these interchangeably, because a Calvinist may think, right, for example, I don't know enough about the Calvinist position, that like sinning is evil, but in this case, Floyd may take the position that God is evil, not that God is sinning, which would be two separate claims. Is that fair and roughly accurate? And is that something we should maybe differentiate?
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, sin is a religious term. So in my worldview, sin doesn't exist. Evil exists in my worldview, but sin doesn't, because sin is a religious term, and I think we both agree that sin means human transgression against God's law. But
yeah, that is evil. That's what evil is. Yeah. Evil is sin.
So right. So if we say morality, though, in the Christian worldview, if morality comes from God's nature, and we view what is morally good as defined, for example, in 1 Corinthians 13, where it describes love. Love is patient, kind, and so forth. And we see this God not behaving such, and I think that contradicts what love is. Here? And we were told God has a loving nature, but yet He contradicts how love is defined. So again, I think that's another contradiction within the Calvinist worldview. Thus, it's incoherent, and we can declare God as evil based on that standard in 1 Corinthians 13.
I'm going to use an analogy that's going to make people laugh, but that's okay. Think of God as a combination pizza, right? And all of His attributes on that, all of the attributes on that pizza, that's pizza, right? All the different ingredients, the toppings on that pizza are all toppings, but it's still the pizza, right? You have love, you have wrath, you have hate, you have all of our emotions that we have as humans are reflections or images of His attributes, of Himself. We are made in His image. There is no emotion that we have that God doesn't have. There is no emotion that we express that God doesn't express. God expresses those emotions perfectly as an omnipotent being. We are a poor excuse for a representation of those attributes expressed perfectly. Jesus gets angry, rages, destroys, smashes up tables at the temple, cusses people out on the streets, but He did it perfectly and righteously. Whereas when we're doing it for our own benefit and not for God's glory, right? That's when it's imperfect, and that's when it becomes evil and sin.
Right.
God isn't all loving only, right? No, I'm talking about your essence here where you're talking about love. Why would a loving God do X, Y, and Z or allow this to happen? He's not just all loving. He's also, if you want to use the all thing, because I don't believe in omnibenevolence. That is not a theology that the Scripture teaches. That is a man-made doctrine.
Would this be similar?
He is also omni-wrath. Yeah.
Would this be similar,
Right.
real quick? I want you to finish your thought, but I just want to make sure. Would this be similar to the analogy of a parent who loves their kids unconditionally, but also spanks them if they just jump out into the street? If that's what it takes to keep them from jumping out without looking both ways, because you love them, you may swat their behind. Is that roughly a similar analogy that you're looking for?
Well, I mean, that would be a representation. The family it's all about reflections. I like to call it reflections. The relationship in the Trinity is a reflection of the relationship in a family. The relationship of the family is a reflection of the relationship of the church. The relationship of the church is the reflection. I mean, that's all of those things were reflections of how that acts. So yes, as God the Father is like a father, right? Who, doesn't want to necessarily see his children suffer, but in order to accomplish his will, he's done it. Where I can still spank my child and not take pleasure in spanking him.
Would you say? Oh no. Well, I don't know if we're going to have a question and answer period.
Yeah, we should probably go to that in just. So why don't we try to wrap this up in about 5 minutes? We have a couple questions already, and then we can start to wrap it up after that. So yeah, Floyd, maybe let's wrap another 5 minutes between the two of you. I think, Floyd, you were about to say something, and we'll try to do about 5 minutes. I got a couple of questions already.
Yeah. Well, I have questions for Will. I don't know if I can go straight to them.
Yeah, please do.
But I guess the question is,
let me do one quick.
Is there a different standard?
Let me do one quick
man should act versus God.
One quick interrupt. We actually never set a time. Now, this show normally goes for an hour. I have personally slated 2 hours on the off chance that we went that long. I'm good as long as we want to. I do think getting to some of the questions, but if you gentlemen are okay with going over an hour, I certainly am. I think it's a good discussion, but I'd like to, if it's okay with you gentlemen, we can keep going as long as it seems productive. But Floyd, I did cut you off. Please continue.
Okay. I guess let me try to make my point of what Calvinists believe. Here's Gordon Clark again. It says, as God cannot sin, so in the next place, God is not responsible for sin, even though he decrees it. Perhaps it would be well, before we conclude, to give a little more scriptural evidence that God indeed decrees and causes sin. 2 Chronicles 18:20-22 reads, then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, I will persuade him. And the Lord said to him, in what way? So he said, I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And the Lord said, you shall persuade him and also prevail. Go out and do so. Now, therefore, look, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of these prophets of yours, and the Lord has declared disaster against you. This passage definitely says the Lord caused the prophets to lie. Other similar passages ought easily to come to one's remembrance, but that God is not responsible for the sin he causes is a conclusion closely connected to the preceding argument. So again, I see this from Calvinists over and over again. They said, even though, yet so, God does all these things, he's not really responsible for it. So my question is, if God is actually decreeing it, instigating it, creating the wills for it to happen, how can he not be responsible for it?
Because he didn't do it himself. He is responsible for it in the sense that you're trying to connect here, right? And the way you're trying to connect the two, yes, because he's the ultimate authority on everything, that therefore he is then responsible for these things. Yes, but he is not guilty of that act because he has not committed it himself willingly.
So if I hire a hitman to kill someone and the hitman kills that person, I'm not responsible.
Well, just at it, but there's the example of the author of a book, right? I mean, the author of the book isn't, so within the entire world of a book, which is presumably coherent, it has to have a internal, even if it's a science fiction book, even if it's a Harry Potter, the rules of that book are vastly different than the rules of life as we understand it, but it has to be internally consistent. It has to be any number of things for people to enjoy and read it. But when somebody kills somebody in Harry Potter, of course, within that book, there are consequences and there's moral repercussions from having done that. But outside of the book, there isn't any for the author.
Exactly.
Right, but he is the author, though. He declared it. He made it happen. He wanted it to happen. He was pleased to make it happen.
Yeah. So I don't disagree with you. In the sovereign state of it, he is the author of sin in that sense. Absolutely. I don't, like I mentioned before, it doesn't matter what theological position, unless you say that God isn't God, or you're a dualist, where Satan is also an eternal being who is God's, Lex Luthor, which isn't Christian, by the way. So there aren't any Christian doctrines to state that God did not create or author everything. Right? They may, but the problem that an Arminius and a Molinist will have in arguing against a Calvinist is they'll say they like to. I think that they have a low view of God. They try to think of themselves far too highly as being equal to. Right? That's the sin in the garden. Was the serpent says you will be equal to God. That's the greatest sin is taking where we are in the hierarchy and looking to God and saying, I am the same as you, and so therefore I deserve, the same type of respect that you get. Right? That's the greatest sin of all, in my opinion. That was the start of all sin. Right? Is elevating ourselves to a position of moral equivalency with God. That's what sin is.
Right. God didn't want the competition.
Well, he doesn't want the competition. He can't be competed with. We're not eternal beings, right? We are finite, created beings. We're a character in the book. Could the character in the book, the paperback book, because this is the power dynamic between God and man. I like to use a video game, right? If the person who authored Halo, is he immoral for the people in the game killing each other, even though he authored it to happen? Is he immoral? Should he be held accountable to account for the characters killing each other in the game?
Or for the suffering, for any real suffering he caused, yes.
Suffering by whose standard? What is this? How does a person who created a game view the suffering of the characters in the game? Does that affect him in a way?
Oh, it doesn't affect him, but because he's immune from it all, right? He's just watching it happen, and whatever happens in the story, it doesn't affect him, right? But he does it all for his own pleasure, right? So he's creating
he made the game for his pleasure.
Great suffering for his own pleasure, right?
As many authors have done throughout time.
Makes right? God's might makes right. Whatever God,
if he's God,
does is righteous, right?
Yeah, it's a logical impossibility for him to be a sinful, evil being if he is a tri-omni being who created everything that exists in this world.
Yeah, so it's a double standard
based on this world standard.
Not based on what you do, but rather who you are.
Sure,
right.
Everything is based off who you are. Right. The only reason why you have autonomy here in the United States is because of who the United States government is. Right. If you lived in an authoritarian dictatorship, they could come to your house, take you, and throw you into prison, and all you want. Right. Your autonomy is based because
they have the power to do so. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it comes down to power. And not justice, not fairness. It comes down to what you can get away with, right? And God can get away with everything, right?
What do you mean by get away with? He did everything,
right? Because there's nothing above him, right?
Correct. How's that getting away with something? You get that the term you're using there is insinuating that he's guilty.
Well, no one can punish him, right? There's no authority over him, right? Yeah, Gordon Clark puts it excellent the way you describe it. It says another aspect of human conditions presupposed by the laws God imposed on man is that they carry with them a penalty that cannot be inflicted on God. So that's why you said, there's no penalty that can be inflicted on God. Man is responsible because God calls him to account. Man is responsible
Correct.
because the supreme power can punish him for disobedience. God, on the contrary, cannot be responsible for the plain reason that there is no power superior to him. No greater being can hold him accountable. No one can punish him. There is no one to whom God is responsible. There are no laws which he could disobey. So what that basically boils down to is absolute power corrupts absolutely. He's just a dictator who can do whatever the hell he wants because he's in control and has complete power. So he can do whatever he wants. He's not accountable to anyone, right? So if you have a dictator, that can do whatever, he can do whatever he wants and get away with it. That's what I mean.
The word dictator is an emotionally charged word that you're particularly using. He's the creator. He's the author of the book.
God doesn't dictate.
So is the author of Harry Potter, is she a dictator? Hold on. Is she a dictator for writing the book? Is she, because those characters in that book, every action, every step, every word, every thought they have is written by her, right? So therefore she is morally responsible. She's a dictator of them. She's inhumane because she wrote that book.
And let's let him answer, and then I'm gonna ask a couple of questions, and then we'll wrap it up unless you have any other specific questions for each other. But please answer that, Floyd.
Yeah, in this case, he's authoring it, but the Calvinistic God is also going to hold his creation responsible for it, right?
Yeah. The same way that the characters of the book are held responsible and are punished in the book.
Well, he's having other people punish them if they are punished, right? But in this case, the author himself is holding these characters responsible and will punish them, right? For something that
the author can't not hold them. The author of Harry Potter, she wrote every action, the evil, the good, the consequences for that evil, everything that was directed and written by her, right? She, after writing the book, she said, "Man, that was a good book. I enjoy it. I'm glad I wrote it." Even though there's suffering in it, right? So how is she a dictator, moral monster, if to her it's just a story, it's just a book, right? She loves the characters that are in it. She created them; they're her creation, right? I'm a product designer. I love my designs, right? They're mine. But if I end up crumpling one up and throwing it in the trash and using a different one and going away, am I a moral monster? I don't understand the contradiction.
Would you say our reality is just a mere story? It's just, that no any consequence. It's just a pleasant story, nice little story. Is that all that human existence is to you?
Yes.
That's all it is.
Is it a story?
It doesn't matter.
We are creation. We were created for His glory, for His good purpose. Right?
So we're just
to be a vessel of wrath or a vessel of. Yep.
100%. It doesn't matter just as long as God is glorified, right?
Correct.
All right. Well, let me.
That's the point.
So we had a couple of questions. So But a couple of them, I think, probably already know at least how Will's going to answer. I don't think they're necessarily applicable. But we had one which pointed out, okay, so premise one, God is omnipotent. Two, he's omniscient. Three, sin is acting against God's will. The conclusion, sin cannot exist. Because how could you act against the will of a God that is omnipotent and omniscient? Any thoughts, either of you gentlemen?
What was the question again?
So it was actually just an argument that was posted. Okay, if you premise one is that God is omnipotent, two is that he's omniscient, three, sin is acting against God's will, and the conclusion is sin cannot exist, presumably because you cannot act against the will of both an omnipotent and omniscient being. How could one act against their will? Everything that must necessarily be
It's
in their will.
disobedience is what sin is. It's a transgression of the law. It's disobedience.
Floyd, any thoughts?
It's God said, "Don't eat." You ate.
Yeah,
That's the sin.
Yeah. Well, in Calvinism, it was God's will to have humans sin. He wanted them to sin, and He will hold them responsible for something that God Himself decreed.
If He didn't want them to sin, they wouldn't have sinned. That's a logical congruency. It's not a contradiction.
Right? He wanted them to sin.
He
and
can't
He'll hold
but
them
not want
responsible
them to
for
sin.
sinning.
Sure.
Right? Yeah. He decreed it. He decreed that Adam and Eve would fall, and all the consequences that would result from it would happen. And He did it. Why? For God's own glory, for His own pleasure. He was pleased to do so.
Sure.
Right.
I'm still waiting for the contradiction, though. Like, you make that sound like that's a bad thing.
Yeah. I completely understand. I think I completely understand your perspective, Will, but I do see why Floyd thinks that's a bad thing. I do. I will. Okay. Apologies.
In Revelation 21:4, we read, "He will wipe away every tear from their eye. Death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away." Now, why do you think God would do that?
Why God would do what?
Wipe away
Because He
every tear
promised to
from
do
their
it.
eye. Death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore. Why would He do that?
Because He promised to do it before the foundation of the earth.
Yeah, but there's no particular reason why He would do that. Is there any value?
Because He wanted
Is there
to.
any value? But there's no value in it.
No,
So
I don't know the value of what God said. Like, there's a huge misunderstanding on the level of what a triomni God would be, what that being entails, and what we are. Right? There is a massive. It's like us looking at the ant. It's probably not even that close. Right?
to
the ant,
it's
the ant
totally
is
different standard.
Yeah, absolutely a totally different standard.
What does it mean to be made in the image of God?
A photograph is in the image of me.
Right.
But a reflection is my image, but it's not me.
Right. But there has to be some sort of similarity, right? What is that similarity?
Yeah, we have emotions, right? We love, we hate, we cry, we fight, right? We do all of those things. Yeah.
God does those things?
Yeah. The Bible says God does those things.
God cries?
Sure he does. Yeah, he weeps. Jesus wept.
The human Jesus or the divine Jesus?
Jesus was God. Fully man, fully God at the same time.
Did it please Jesus to cry?
Sure. I don't know if it pleased him. You'd have to ask him. He didn't say.
Well, everything that comes to pass, he decreed, right? He does it because it pleases him, right? So
Yeah,
all
he
the
did it because he
suffering,
wanted to do it. He even asked. He
anything,
even
even to
asked
him,
to
pleases him.
not be crucified. Yeah, he even asked to not be crucified.
Right. Well, yeah. Now we're dealing with, Jesus being 100% man and 100% God, whatever that means.
Right, but there's a plurality in the Trinity, right? You have Genesis 1.
Right.
They are completely content and whole. He did not need to create us. He didn't create us because we were lonely, because he was lonely. The triune God was complete in its existence. It did so out of its
So why did he
own
create it all?
pleasure. Out of his own pleasure.
Right.
Same reason why an author writes a book. They thought it would be fun.
So it's completely arbitrary, right?
I couldn't tell you why God did what he did, why God created. All we know is that he did, and he did it for his pleasure.
Right. He's going to take away
That's all
death.
the
He's going to
scripture.
take away. He's going to wipe away tears from people's eye, just because it pleases him, right? It's totally arbitrary.
Sure.
Right.
And if it pleased him to throw the other half in a burning lake for all of eternity, that's what pleases him.
Right. So God is the ultimate narcissistic dictator, right? I mean, how else would you describe it?
Right, you're putting colorful language that applies to someone that is taking advantage of someone who's their equal, has the same autonomy as them. We don't have this. We are not God's equal, and we don't have the same autonomy as a triomni being.
It doesn't have to be equal.
Right? It's a harsh. It does have to be equal.
Well, presumably
So when you fumigate your house,
it's how this God treats a image, his image, right? It's how he treats his image bearers. Okay. He created image bearers, and this is how he treats them, right? With complete arbitrariness for his own pleasure.
Sure.
Yeah.
You act like an image bearer. Like you act like if I take a photograph of myself and I crumple it up and throw it in the trash, I've done something wrong.
All right. Well, I think at this point, because I think we get the point. I think Floyd is a very specific point that he's been making, and I think actually we all are sort of in rough agreement as to what the rules are, just whether or not they should be that way, or that makes any sense. I think is where the disagreement lies. So let me ask. There's a question here. God promised Abraham the lands of Canaan, I think. Because Canaanites. Yeah.
Canaan.
Canaan.
Canaan. Yeah.
Canaan. Thank you. But Abraham died unfulfilled by God's promise. Do you think that that's how it happened?
He promised him and his descendants, right?
But it's beyond my knowledge. So you're asking me. You said, yeah, right, as if I know.
No, I mean that's what he did, but he's saying that because Abraham didn't see himself, that therefore that's a contradiction. That's not a contradiction. If you're looking at it from a patriarchal society where a person's descendants are very important to them, right? It's completely different standard than what they had then, right? His lineage, his heritage, eventually did receive the land of Canaan.
All right.
So how is that a contradiction?
So I'm actually going to, and I think this, Jake Forty framed it well. Actually, I think this is something that I've been trying to sort of wrap my head around how to frame the problem of contradiction, because we keep switching orders. So we'll go with this, and then I want to each of you to just give sort of a closing statement, and then we'll be done. But this is for each of you. God, okay. Proposition 1: God wills someone to sin. Proposition 2: sin is the act of going against God's will. How is this not incoherent?
Going against God's will was not a clear way of me discussing it, right? And what I meant by will was disobeying God. I think I said that. Disobeying God, that's what sin is, right? Disobeying God.
Secret will and prescriptive will. He's going against God's law. He's not going against God's decretive will.
All right. So
God said, "Don't eat the tree," so you ate the tree.
Or or the. But it does seem to me, and I don't know if I want to start a new rabbit hole. the inconsistency. Well, no, I'm not going to go down there. So, gentlemen, thank you both very much. I think it was a very interesting and informative debate, and I really
That was fun.
appreciate hearing from both of you. So, what I would like to do, Will, wow, I'm tired. Floyd, you started first. I'd like to hear your any closing remarks you'd like to make, and then we'll go to Will, and then that'll be it.
Okay, I'd like to end with an analogy. It's not completely original for me, but I edited it to make it more consistent with Calvinistic theology. Anyway, I'll read it. It says, before any of my children were conceived, I decided I would love my first child unconditionally. Any subsequent children I would hate based on the nature I determined them to have. I decided to have a particular number of children. As they grew, I gave them a rule book. I promised blessings if they loved me and obeyed me, and punishment if they disobeyed me. Only I knew from their compliance would not happen. I already determined their will to disobey me. However, in the meantime, I provided all of their needs, giving them food, shelter, schooling, etc. On my oldest child's 13th birthday, I injected a drug into him that changed his nature, where he could not resist being grateful towards me. I then gave him $1 million to bless him while I passed over his siblings. Not because he behaved any better than his brothers, but because I chose him before he was born. In fact, he had always demonstrated an antipathy towards me, just as his siblings have. I knew they inherited their disobedient disposition from their ancestors, but it isn't something they inherited from my nature. Despite this, his changed nature that I forced upon him made him eternally grateful towards me. For my other children, I did not prevent a pedophile to imprison, abuse, and torture them. When they protested, I told them that I made this irrevocable choice before they were born not to help them. As they cried out in agony, I reminded them that they had misbehaved quite often and so deserved their fate. But why did you conceive us then, they cried? Because this is my good pleasure and it glorifies me. Also, just think of how much your older brother will appreciate me not allowing the same thing happen to him, I rebuked them. After all, I can do whatever I want, just like the molder can do to a lump of clay. Upon seeing my actions, my neighbors praised me for being so wise, just, and loving. Wasn't it wonderful for me to give my oldest child that money? After all, he didn't deserve it. And my other children were fortunate to get what they did before I let them go their own way. My friends were pleased and voted me Father of the Year. So I'll end with that.
All right. Thank you, Floyd. So, Will, any final remarks?
My final remark is basically just that there is and this is the issue. This is the issue of all the trouble with God is a human pride to feel that they are equal to a triomny being who created all that exists. And that is what sin is. That's what idolatry is. That is what goes against that. It's the normal, since the original fall that God planned, that has been our default nature, is to see ourselves as God's equal and blame him for doing things that he is logically impossible to do. And that's what he's chosen for us to do for his pleasure, for whatever reason he decided to do it. Because we can't understand or even think to comprehend anything more than what he's revealed to us. So if that triomni God exists, that is the only logical position. Everything else is illogical if that being exists. Well, whether you believe that or not, that's up to him. So.
All right. Will, thank you very much. I hope you guys will consider coming back. I certainly think either something on coherency of belief and or coherency of free will would be another interesting topic. But until such time, if you've gotten this far, hopefully you've liked the stream. I hope you will give it a thumbs up. That really does help us in the algorithms. So it's a great way to support us. You can also go into the Discord. I don't know if you gentlemen will be free to join us in the Discord afterwards. I hope if you have a little time left. I know Floyd's been in our Discord a couple times. Will, I don't know if you have it. If I can get you that. If you don't,
I can join it here. I think Titus put the link in there.
Yes, he did. So perfect. But anyways, then we've got Digital Hammurabi Dr. Josh is coming. On Thursday, we've got Dr. Josh on Christian apologetics for the Old Testament, and I think we're going to be looking forward to that. Thank you all for joining us and watching, and thank you, Floyd. Always nice to have you on. Really appreciate it. Will, good to see you again. Good night, all, and see you soon.